Chapter 3 of Man, King of Mind, Body, and Circumstance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Man, King of Mind, Body, and Circumstance by James Allen. Chapter 3. Habit, its slavery, and its freedom. Man is subject to the law of habit. Is he then free? Yes, he is free. Man did not make life and its laws. They are eternal. He finds himself involved in them, and he can understand and obey them. Man's power does not enable him to make laws of being. It subsists in discrimination and choice. Man does not create one jot of the universal conditions or laws. They are the essential principles of things, and are neither made nor unmade. He discovers, not makes them. Ignorance of them is at the root of the world's pain. To defy them is folly and bondage. Who is the freer man, the thief who defies the laws of his country, or the honest citizen who obeys them? Who again is the freer man, the fool who thinks he can live as he likes, or the wise man who chooses to do only that which is right? Man is, in the nature of things, a being of habit, and this he cannot alter. But he can alter his habits. He cannot alter the law of his nature, but he can adapt his nature to the law. No man wishes to alter the law of gravitation, but all men adapt themselves to it. They use it by bending to it, not by defying or ignoring it. Men do not run up against walls or jump over precipices in hope that this law will alter for them. They walk alongside walls and keep clear of precipices. Man can no more get outside of the law of habit than he can get outside of the law of gravitation, but he can employ it wisely or unwisely. As scientists and inventors master the physical forces and laws by obeying and using them, so wise men mastered the spiritual forces and laws in the same way. While the bad man is the whipped slave of habit, the good man is its wise director and master. Not its maker, let me reiterate, nor its arbitrary commander, but its self-disciplined user, its master by virtue of knowledge grounded on obedience. He is the bad man whose habits of thought and action are bad. He is the good man whose habits of thought and action are good. The bad man becomes the good man by transforming or transmuting his habits. He does not alter the law, he alters himself. He adapts himself to the law. Instead of submitting to selfish indulgences, he obeys moral principles. He becomes the master of the lower by enlisting in the services of the higher. The law of habit remains the same, but he is changed from bad to good by his readjustment to the law. Habit is repetition. Man repeats the same thoughts, the same actions, the same experiences over and over again until they are incorporated within his being, until they are built into his character as part of himself. Faculty is a fixed habit. Evolution is mental accumulation. Man, today, is the result of millions of repetitious thoughts and acts. He is not ready-made. He becomes, and is still becoming. His character is predetermined by his own choice. The thought, the act, which he chooses, that by habit he becomes. Thus each man is an accumulation of thoughts and deeds. The characteristics which he manifests instinctively and without effort are lines of thoughts and action become, by long repetition, automatic, for it is the nature of habit to become, at last, unconscious, to repeat, as it were, itself without any apparent choice or effort on the part of its possessor, and in due time it takes such complete possession of the individual as to appear to render his will powerless to counteract it. This is the cause with all habits, whether good or bad. When bad, the man is spoken of as being the victim, of a bad habit or a vicious mind. When good, he is referred to as having, by nature, a good disposition. All men are, and will continue to be, subject to their own habits, whether they be good or bad, that is, subject to their own reiterated and accumulated thoughts and deeds. Knowing this, the wise man chooses to subject himself to good habits, for such service is joy, bliss, and freedom, while to become subject to bad habits is misery, wretchedness, slavery. This law of habit is beneficent, for while it enables man to bind himself to the chains of slovish practices, it enables him to become so fixed in good courses as to do them unconsciously, to do instinctively that which is right, without restraint or exertion, and in perfect happiness and freedom. Observing this automatism in life, men have denied the existence of will or freedom on man's part. They speak of him as being born, good or bad, and regard him as the helpless instrument of blind forces. It is true that man is the instrument of mental forces, or, to be more accurate, he is those forces, but they are not blind, and he can direct them, and redirect them into new channels. In a word, he can take himself in hand and reconstruct his habits, for though it is also true that he is born with a given character, that character is the product of numberless lives during which it has been slowly built up by choice and effort, and in this life it will be considerably modified by new experiences. No matter how apparently helpless a man has become under the tyranny of a bad habit or a bad characteristic, they are essentially the same. He can, so long as sanity remains, break away from it and become free, replacing it by its opposite good habit, and when the good possesses him as the bad formerly did, there will be neither wish nor need to break from that, for its dominance will be perennial happiness and not perpetual misery. That which a man has formed within himself he can break up and reform when he so wishes and wills, and a man does not wish to abandon a bad habit so long as he regards it as pleasurable. It is when it assumes a painful tyranny over him that he begins to look for a way to escape, and finally abandons the bad for something better. No man is helplessly bound. The very law by which he has become a self-bound slave will enable him to become a self-emancipated master. To know this, he has but to act upon it, that is, deliberately and strenuously to abandon the old lines of thought and conduct, and diligently fashion new and better lines. That he may not accomplish this in a day, in a week, a month, a year, or 5 years, should not dishearten and dismay him. Time is not required for the new repetitions to become established, and old ones to be broken up, but the law of habit is certain and infallible, and a line of effort patiently pursued and never abandoned is sure to be crowned with success. For if a bad condition, a mere negation, can become fixed and firm, how much more surely can a good condition, a positive principle, become established and powerful. A man is powerless to overcome the wrong and unhappy elements in himself only so long as he regards himself as powerless. If to the bad habit is added the thought, "I cannot," the bad habit will remain. Nothing will be overcome till the thought of powerlessness is uprooted and abolished from the mind. The great stumbling block is not the habit itself, it is the belief in the impossibility of overcoming it. How can a man overcome a bad habit so long as he is convinced that it is impossible? How can a man be prevented from overcoming it when he knows that he can, and is determined to do it? The dominant thought by which man has enslaved himself is the thought, "I cannot overcome my sins." Bring this thought out into the light, in all its nakedness, and it is seen to be a belief in the power of evil, with its other pole, disbelief in the power of good. For a man to say or believe that he cannot rise above wrong thinking and wrong doing is to submit to evil, is to abandon and renounce good. By such thoughts, such beliefs, man binds himself, By their opposite thoughts, opposite beliefs, he sets himself free. A changed attitude of mind changes the character, the habits, the life. Man is his own deliverer. He has brought about his thraldom. He can bring about his emancipation. All through the ages he has looked, and is still looking, for an external deliverer, but he still remains bound. The great deliverer is within. He is the Spirit of Truth, and the Spirit of Truth is the Spirit of Good, and he is in the Spirit of Good who dwells habitually in good thoughts and their effects, good actions. Man is not bound by any power outside his own wrong thoughts, and from these he can set himself free, and foremost, the enslaving thoughts from which he needs to be delivered are: I cannot rise. I cannot break away from bad habits. I cannot alter my nature. I cannot control and conquer myself. I cannot cease from sin. All these cannots have no existence in the things to which they submit. They exist only in thought. Such negotiations are bad thought habits which need to be eradicated, and in their place should be planted the positive "I can," which should be tended and developed until it becomes a powerful tree of habit, bearing the good and life-giving fruit of right and happy living. Habit binds us. Habit sets us free. Habit is primarily in thought, secondarily in deed. Turn the thought from bad to good, and the deed will immediately follow. Persist in the bad, and it will bind you tighter and tighter. Persist in the good, and it will take you into ever-widening spheres of freedom. He who loves his bondage, let him remain bound. He who thirsts for freedom, let him come and be set free. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Chapter 4 of Man, King of Mind, Body, and Circumstance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Man, King of Mind, Body, and Circumstance by James Allen. Chapter 4. Bodily Conditions. There are today scores of distinct schools devoted to the healing of the body, a fact which shows the great prevalence of physical suffering, as the hundreds of religions devoted to the comforting of men's minds prove the universality of mental suffering. Each of these schools has its place in so far as it is able to relieve suffering, even where it does not eradicate the evil, for with all these schools of healing, the fact of disease and pain remains with us, just as sin and sorrow remain in spite of the many religions. Disease and pain, like sin and sorrow, are too deep-seated to be removed by palliatives. Our ailments have an ethical cause deeply rooted in the mind. I do not infer by this that physical conditions have no part in disease. They play an important part as instruments, as factors in the chain of causation. The microbe that carried the Black Death was the instrument of uncleanliness, and uncleanliness is, primarily, a moral disorder. Matter is visible mind, and that bodily conflict which we call disease has a causal affinity to that mental conflict which is associated with sin. In his present human or self-conscious state, man's mind is continually being disturbed by violently conflicting desires, and his body attacked by morbid elements. He is in a state of mental inharmony and bodily discomfort. Animals in their wild and primitive state are free from disease because they are free from inharmony. They are in accord with their surroundings, have no moral responsibility and no sense of sin, and are free from those violent disturbances of remorse, grief, disappointment, etc., which are so destructive of man's harmony and happiness, and their bodies are not afflicted. As man ascends into the divine or cosmic conscious state, he will leave behind and below him all these inner conflicts, will overcome sin and all sense of sin, and will dispel remorse and sorrow. Being thus restored to mental harmony, he will become restored to bodily harmony, to wholeness, health. The body is the image of the mind, and in it are traced the visible features of hidden thoughts. The outer obeys the inner, and the enlightened scientist of the future may be able to trace every bodily disorder to its ethical cause in the mentality. Mental harmony, or moral wholeness, makes for bodily health. I say makes for it will not produce it magically, as it were, as though one should swallow a bottle of medicine and then be whole and free. But if the mentality is becoming more poised and restful, if the moral structure is increasing, then a sure foundation of bodily wholeness is being laid. The forces are being conserved, and are receiving a better direction and adjustment. And even if perfect health is not gained, the bodily derangement, whatever it may be, will have lost its power to undermine the strengthened and uplifted mind. One who suffers in body will not necessarily at once be cured when he begins to fashion his mind on moral and harmonious principles. Indeed, for a time, while the body is bringing to a crisis and throwing off the effects of former inharmonies, the morbid condition may appear to be intensified. As man does not gain perfect peace immediately he enters upon the path of righteousness, but must, except in rare instances, pass through a painful period of adjustment, neither does he, with the same rare exceptions, at once acquire perfect health. Time is required for bodily as well as mental readjustment, and even if health is not reached, it will be approached. If the mind be made robust, the bodily condition will take a secondary and subordinate place, and will cease to have that primary importance which so many give to it. If a disorder is not cured, the mind can rise above it, and refuse to be subdued by it. One can be happy, strong, and useful in spite of it. The statement so often made by health specialists that a useful and happy life is impossible without bodily health is disproved by the fact that numbers of men who have accomplished the greatest works, men of genius and superior talent in all departments, have been afflicted in their bodies, and today there are plenty of living witnesses to this fact. Sometimes the bodily affliction acts as a stimulus to mental activity, and aids rather than hinders its work. To make a useful and happy life dependent upon health is to put matter before mind, is to subordinate spirit to body. Men of robust minds do not dwell upon their bodily condition if it be in any way disordered. They ignore it, and work on, live on, as though it were not. This ignoring of the body not only keeps the mind sane and strong, but it is the best resource for curing the body. If we cannot have a perfectly sound body, we can have a healthy mind, and a healthy mind is the best route to a sound body. A sickly mind is more deplorable than a disordered body, and it leads to sickliness of body. The mental invalid is in a far more pitiful condition than the bodily invalid. There are invalids, every physician knows them, who only need to lift themselves into a strong, unselfish, happy frame of mind to discover that their body is whole and capable. Sickly thoughts about oneself, about one's body and food, should be abolished by all who are called by the name of man. The man who imagines that the wholesome food he is eating is going to injure him needs to come to bodily vigor by the way of mental strength. To regard one's bodily health and safety as being dependent on a particular kind of food which is absent from nearly every household is to court petty disorders. The vegetarian who says he dare not eat potatoes, that fruit produces indigestion, that apples give him acidity, that pulses are poison, that he is afraid of green vegetables, and so on, is demoralizing the noble cause which he professes to have espoused, is making it look ridiculous in the eyes of those robust meat-eaters who live above such sickly fears and morbid self-scrutinies. To imagine that the fruits of the earth, eaten when one is hungry and in need of food, are destructive of health and life is totally to misunderstand the nature and office of food. The office of food is to sustain and preserve the body, not to undermine and destroy it. It is a strange delusion, and one that must react deleteriously upon the body that possesses so many who are seeking health by the way of diet, the delusion that certain of the simplest, most natural, and purest of viands are bad of themselves, that they have in them the elements of death and not of life. One of these food reformers once told me that he believed his ailment, as well as the ailments of thousands of others, was caused by eating bread, not by an excess of bread, but by the bread itself, and yet this man's bread food consisted of nutty, homemade, wholemeal loaves. Let us get rid of our sins, our sickly thoughts, our self-indulgences and foolish excesses, before attributing our diseases to such innocent causes. Dwelling upon one's petty troubles and ailments is a manifestation of weakness of character. To so dwell upon them in thought leads to frequent talking about them, and this in turn impresses them more vividly upon the mind, which soon becomes demoralized by such petting and pitying. It is as convenient to dwell upon happiness and health as upon misery and disease, as easy to talk about them, and much more pleasant and profitable to do so. Let us live happily then, not hating those who hate us. Among men who hate us, let us dwell free from hatred. Let us live happily then, free from ailments among the ailing. Among men who are ailing, let us dwell free from ailments. Let us live happily then, free from greed among the greedy. Among men who are greedy, let us dwell free from greed. Moral principles are the soundest foundations for health as well as happiness. They are the true regulators of conduct, and they embrace every detail of life. When earnestly espoused and intelligently understood, they will compel a man to reorganize his entire life, down to the most apparently insignificant detail. While definitely regulating one's diet, they will put an end to squeamishness, food fear, and foolish whims and groundless opinions as to the harmfulness of foods. When sound moral health has eradicated self-indulgence and self-pity, all natural foods will be seen as they are, nourishers of the body, and not its destroyers. Thus a consideration of bodily conditions brings us inevitably back to the mind, and to those moral virtues which fortify it with an invincible protection. The morally right are the bodily right. To be continually transposing the details of life from passing views and fancies, without reference to fixed principles, is to flounder in confusion, but to discipline details by moral principles is to see, with enlightened vision, all details in their proper place and order. For it is given to moral principles alone, in their personal domain, to perceive the moral order. In them alone resides the insight that penetrates to causes, and with them only is the power to at once command all details to their order and place, as the magnet draws and polarizes the filings of steel. Better than curing the body is to rise above it, to be its master, and not to be tyrannized over by it, not to abuse it, not to pander it, never to put its claims before virtue, to discipline and moderate its pleasures, and not to be overcome by its pains. In a word, to live in the poise and strength of the moral powers. This, better than bodily cure, is yet a safe way to cure, and it is a permanent source of mental vigor and spiritual repose. Chapter 4. Recording by Andrea Fiore.